Are you secretly hoping that a set-aside is your golden ticket to government contracting riches? Surely you've heard of set-asides, the famed protectors of small businesses and guarantors of federal market success? I know I did. I started my first GovCon shop right after I left the Marine Corps. I didn't know what I was going to sell or even how to sell. But a friend of mine told me that as a vet, I could make millions selling to the government. So I gave it a shot. And well, that company never even won a single government contract, which stung. But at least I wasn't alone. Every year, about 100,000 companies register to sell to the government, many with set-asides, but only about 1,500 new businesses win a contract in their first year, and 20,000 of those businesses quit after that first year. So maybe that made me feel a little better? But 6 years later, I started my second company, and we've won 8 government contracts worth about 2.7 mil. And the federal government isn't even our primary customer. And I want to let you in on the unsexy secret, because I didn't become some sort of super GovCon genius in 6 years. The only difference between here and here, aside from not waking up in a cold sweat every morning, was that in between, I'd talked to over 215 GovCon founders about what they did to be successful. And I was laser focused on executing their advice on how to start a GovCon business and how to get the most out of my set-aside. And some of their advice was a little controversial. It certainly goes against what a lot of the other YouTubers are teaching, especially when it comes to sole source awards. But I've got the receipts. I pulled and analyzed the data on every award in 2023, so I know those founders' insights were spot on. So I'm going to give you an honest perspective on the 7 ways set-asides actually help new businesses, debunk the most common set-aside myths, explain what you need to do to actually unlock their value, and at the end, I'll share my set-aside work plan, including how to qualify and apply for your set-asides, so that you can ruthlessly take action and prioritize your time onto things that will get you the most results for the least amount of effort. And let's start with probably the most valuable and most misunderstood set-aside benefit, being able to bid on billions in set-aside contracts every year. Set-aside contracts are like government contracting's $100 billion minor leagues, where new entrepreneurs can learn the ropes and build their businesses, so that when they're called into the majors, they're ready to compete head-to-head against big businesses like Booz Allen and Lockheed Martin. So when a contract is set aside, basically the government says, hey, this RFP that we just released, the one right there, well, we're setting it aside so that only small businesses can bid on it. So large businesses, stay the F away. And when this happens, it's called a total small business set-aside contract, because any small business can bid on it, but large businesses can't. And contracts can also be set aside for specific kinds of small businesses, like woman-owned, service-disabled veteran-owned, 8A or HUBZone small businesses. And there are a couple other set-asides, but these are the big ones. Pretty simple concept. Now let's start layering on the nuance, and to help, let's work through an example. So let's say the government wants to buy pencils. So they put out a pencil RFP. But they want to buy pencils from a woman-owned small business, so they make that RFP woman-owned set-aside. And to help you understand what that does, let's play some Guess Who. First, it means that these large businesses can't bid on it. And it means that these non-woman-owned small businesses can't bid on it, leaving a much smaller pool of woman-owned small businesses who can. So when contracts are set aside, there's a smaller pool of potential bidders. Maybe they're easier to win. And set-asides aren't just for pencil-sized contracts. They can be worth tens of millions of dollars. In fact, the average set-aside contract in 2023 was worth about 5 mil. And the 10 largest set-aside contracts were worth hundreds of millions each. And quick vocabulary lesson. If a contract isn't set aside, it's called a full and open contract, as in it's being fully competed and it's open to all bidders. Next bit of set-aside nuance. Here are all the competed contracts won by small businesses in 2023. And what do you see? Well, what I see is that set-aside contracts account for about 1/3 of all the wins. So set-aside contracts are critical for small business growth. Well, technically subcontracts are the real critical piece for small business growth. More on that in about 8 minutes. But regardless, set-aside contracts are where new businesses are winning work. So as you're thinking about your path to revenue, set-aside contracts are probably going to be a big part of that. And before we can talk about how you can win set-aside contracts, we need to debunk 2 myths that will kill your chances of success. Now, like any good myth, this first one has a kernel of truth to it. In fact, you got a preview of it here. Remember how all these big and smalls couldn't bid because the contract was set aside for woman-owned small businesses? It sure seems like that would make it easier for these woman-owned small businesses to win. But in case you don't believe my highly credible Guess Who teaching aid, here's what the data tells us about set-asides and competition. And we're going to be talking about some really big numbers. So to help you visualize them, we're going to use rice. So imagine that this grain of rice is one company. And there are about 700,000 registered government contracting companies in SAM, which means that if an RFP comes out full and open, theoretically, you could be competing against about 700,000 other bidders. And to give you a sense for just how much that is, that's about 700,000 grains of rice. This is all the companies. Now, let's take a look at the set-aside world. Let's talk about the number of companies with each set-aside. And let's start with SDVOSB. We've got about this many. Next, we have our woman-owns. We got about this many. 8A and HUBZone. 700,000 total companies and a few thousand with each set-aside. With so many fewer companies in the set-aside camp, you'd expect the competition to really drop. Well, guess what? We don't have to guess, because remember, we've got the data. So in 2023, the average full and open contract, so contracts anyone can bid on, got 6 bids, while contracts that were set aside got 5-ish bids. And I know this is counterintuitive. The number of competitors drops dramatically, but the competition barely changes. What's going on? Here's what's happening. So first, the vast majority of these 700,000 companies are zombies. So they registered in SAM, but they never bid on contracts. My best estimate is that only about 200,000, so about this many companies, compete for contracts every year. And the data also tells us that only about 60,000 companies a year actually win anything. Seems crazy that people take the time to register in SAM and then they don't pursue government contracts. Well, think about this. Think about how many people buy gym memberships and then never go. Pretty similar situation. So that's what's skewing our full and open numbers. Now, what's going on with our set-aside contracts? Well, as you can see, there are dramatically fewer companies with each set-aside, but there are still a few thousand with each one, which is plenty of competition. Next, to get a set-aside, these companies spent hours registering in SAM, and then they spent even more time applying for their set-aside. So they're pretty committed to this market. And not surprisingly, they're more active and engaged. So basically, with a full and open contract, there's a huge pool of companies that can bid, but very few actually do. And with set-aside contracts, there's a comparatively small pool of companies that can bid, but they bid more often. And that's why the competition doesn't change that much between full and open and set-aside. And that's the key takeaway here. Set-aside contracts are still very competitive, but there is one big difference between the competition for a full and open versus a set-aside contract, and that's who these companies are. Over here in set-aside land, you're competing against other small businesses, but on this full and open side, you might be competing against Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Deloitte, or Booz Allen. And yeah, you aren't beating them. So are set-aside contracts easier to win? Well, yes, because you aren't competing against these guys. But easier doesn't mean easy. And this is the mistake I made with my first set-aside company. I was expecting easy. Second myth, you should only bid on set-aside contracts. If you only bid on contracts in your set-aside, you are leaving millions of dollars on the table. This is easiest to explain with an example. So imagine you've got the 8A set-aside. You're a world leader in cybersecurity training, you spent 20 years in the Navy, and you know a bunch of key Navy leaders. And you find an RFP on SAM to provide cyber training to the Navy. What a win! But it's set aside for woman-owned small business. That sucks. You can't bid. This RFP was practically written for you, but you're blocked. Well, maybe not. Because even though you can't bid as the prime, thanks to your qualifications and credibility, other people might want to collaborate with you. So if you can find a woman-owned small business that's interested in the contract, but who might not have all the experience and the connections that you have, well, they might be open to bringing you on as a subcontractor. And that works because only the prime contractor has to have the set aside. So a woman-owned prime can bring on an 8A or disabled veteran subcontractor. Hell, they can sub-work to a large business if they want. Now there are limits. The prime has to do 51% of the work, which means the sub is limited to 49% of the contract value, which is frustrating, but I'll take half of a good contract over 0 any day. So now that you understand how set-aside contracts work, how massive the opportunity is, and we've dispensed with the malarkey, here's what you need to do to actually win some. What to do? 1, find partners. First, you need to build relationships with small businesses that have the other set-asides, so that when that perfect contract comes out, but it's set aside for someone else, you can grab a partner and start competing. And the easiest way to find companies with a particular set-aside is to go to SAM, log in, go to Entities, then filter for the set-aside you need. And some of the set-asides have two versions. One that says self-certified and one that says SBA certified. Self-certified means that the company just said, yep, I'm woman-owned or whatever. And SBA certified means that they've submitted all the paperwork and proven to the government that they actually are woman-owned. And a company needs to be SBA certified to win set-aside work. So I recommend selecting SBA certified. Now there's more to finding good partners than just this kind of simple search. So if that's interesting, let me know in the comments below and I'll make a video on that. But this is a good place to start. Second thing you should do is to set up two automated searches. One that alerts you when contracts come out in your set-aside that you could prime, and one that alerts you when contracts come out in any other set-aside that you can sub on. And there are two ways to do this. The first is to log into SAM, then Contract Opportunities, go to Set-asides, select the ones you have, then go to the ellipse and hit Save. And then you can come back every couple of days to see if anything new came out. Then repeat, but choose all the set-asides you don't have. The second way is to create a search with this video sponsor, FedScout. And to do this, just come to the search screen, go to the set-aside filter, and then select the ones you have and hit Save, and then do it again with all the other set-asides. And the big benefit is that FedScout will send you email alerts when new matching contracts come out so that you aren't having to come to SAM every couple of days and you don't accidentally miss something good. And the third thing you need to do is to respond to sources sought. And sources sought are like the seeds that set-aside contracts come from. So if you want set-aside contracts, you better tend to the seeds. Here's what I mean. So before the government can set the contract aside, they have to do some market research to ensure that even if they set a contract aside and reduce the pool of competition, there'll still be enough competition. And the way they do that market research is by releasing a sources sought. And a sources sought basically just lays out what the government is thinking about buying and asking industry, so you and I, to respond with information about what we do and what set-asides we have. And if two or more companies with the same set-aside respond and say, hey, yep, we can do the work, then the government assumes that there'll be enough competition and they can set the contract aside in that set-aside. Here's a quick example. So imagine three small businesses respond to a sources sought, two woman-owned and one SDVOSB. So based on these responses, how could the government set this contract aside? Well, the government only got one SDVOSB response, and they needed two to set the contract aside for SDVOSB, so they can't set it aside for them. Next, the government got two woman-owned responses, so they can set the contract aside for woman-owned small business. And the government got three responses from three small businesses, because remember, all three of these companies are also small businesses, so the government could set this contract aside for total small business. And to be clear, if the government sets the contract aside for woman-owned small business, then any woman-owned small business can bid, not just the two that responded to the sources sought. And if that feels unfair because these two took the time to respond to the sources sought, but all the other woman-owned small businesses out there get the benefit also, well, these two small businesses do get some special value that no one else gets. And this is where you go from playing checkers to three-dimensional chess. More on that shortly. But sources sought have a bad rap because frequently the government will put out the sources sought, people like us spend time writing responses, and then the government doesn't actually follow up with an RFP, which sucks and is really demoralizing. But I still respond to sources sought all the time for 5 reasons, and I encourage you to also. First, they tend to be short and repetitive. So once you've written one sources sought, you can use that response again and again, so your second sources sought shouldn't take very long. Second, responding to a sources sought can lead to an RFP being set aside, which keeps you from having to compete against large, scary companies, which is a good thing. Third, if you respond to a sources sought, you can get a sense for whether the government wants you to win. And this is the three-dimensional chess I talked about. Say you're an 8A, and you and a buddy who's also an 8A responds to a sources sought. So the government got 2 8A responses. So the government met that rule of 2, so you know that they could set the contract aside for you if they wanted to. Then you wait for the RFP to see what the government does. So there's an old saying in the GovCon space. Every RFP has 2 winners. The first winner is the company that wins. The second winner is the company that figured out that they'd lose, so didn't waste time writing a proposal. And by responding to the sources sought and seeing what the government does, these 2 companies will be winners. Here's how. So imagine that the eventual RFP comes out set aside for woman-owned business. Well, this means a couple things. First, it means that the government could have set the contract aside for 8A, but didn't. Second, it means that the government got at least 2 responses from women-owned small businesses. And third, it means that the government liked those women-owned small businesses' responses more than the 8As, more than yours. So it sucks that the government liked the women-owned responses more, but by investing an hour into a sources sought response, these 8A companies saved themselves from wasting many hours on a proposal they were probably going to lose. On the other hand, let's say that the government does set the contract aside for 8A. Well, that's a strong clue that the government liked what the 8As wrote in their sources sought response. So the government set the RFP aside in a way that helps those 8As win. So now you can confidently invest the hours into a proposal knowing that you've got a good chance of winning. Fourth reason to respond to sources sought, they're a great low-risk way to practice writing and build your library of proposal content. And fifth reason, if you write a really interesting sources sought response, the government might remember you and reach out to you to talk. Hell, if they really like what you wrote, they might skip the RFP and give you a... Wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to sell to the government without all the waiting and proposal writing and competition, like in the private sector? Well, you're not going to believe it, but there is! It's called a sole source. And any company with one of these set-asides can get a sole source up to this amount. Here's how it happens. So say you find a government officer that wants your product or service, and for this example, let's say you provide cybersecurity training. The officer does some market research to see who else can provide cyber training, and they can't find anybody else. Or more likely they do find other cyber training companies, but they still want you because maybe the other companies don't address the topics you do, or their quality isn't as good, or their experience isn't as strong. Doesn't really matter why. The important thing is that the government wants to go with you. But when the government buys something, they're supposed to be transparent and put out a public RFP so that everyone has a fair shot at competing for it. But you don't want them to be transparent or to compete the contract publicly because it's slow. Proposal writing is time consuming, and you might lose. So you mentioned to the government officer that you have a set aside and that they could just sole source you a cyber training contract. The contracting officer likes that idea, and they write up a sole source justification that explains why you're different and special and why they need your specific product or service. And they also write up a statement of work that lays out the training you'll provide and the price the government's going to pay. And voila! The sole source justification gets published on sam.gov, and that's it. You just got a contract. Pretty cool, right? And this is where other GovCon educators stop, once they've told you all the good stuff. But here's how many sole source awards were made to small businesses in 2023. So yeah, as you can see, it's not happening a lot. And to understand why the government doesn't sole source that often, let's keep working through our hypothetical. Where did we leave off? Oh yeah, you just got a sole source award and you were feeling pretty good about that. Well, remember when I said that the government publishes the sole source justification that says how unique and special you are in SAM? Well, when that happens, every other company that provides cybersecurity training is going to read it. And they're going to start sending angry emails to the government because they think their product and services are just as good and special as yours. And they're extra pissed because they've been cheated out of the opportunity to even compete for the work. And if they're really mad, they might file a protest, or call their senator or congressman, or complain to your government customer's boss. And now your customer is getting a lot of heat from their leadership about why they decided to circumvent normal competitive buying processes. And what makes you so special? And what exactly is the nature of their relationship with you? And if this happens, your customer might cancel the award. And at the very least, they're going to have to answer a bunch of questions and submit a ton of extra compliance paperwork. So yeah, while a sole source can generally get awarded faster than a normal competed contract, it doesn't save the government any effort in the long run. And sole sources are definitely more stressful, which is why government buyers really prefer to use GWACs and other framework contracts instead of sole sourcing. See the difference in spending? This is the sole source, and this is GWACs and things like them. Big difference. Now, I don't 100% agree that GWACs are a substitute for a sole source, but they're super lucrative, and we'll get to them shortly, so you can judge for yourself then. So sole sources are pretty rare, but they're awesome when they happen. So what can you do to get one? First, clearly differentiate your product and service from everyone else's. To award a sole source, the government has to explain what makes your product or service so special, that it warrants going around the typical competitive process. So be ready to help the government with this write-up. Second, make it easy for the government, so pre-draft a sole source justification that you can just hand to them. Third, build trust-based relationships with any potential government customers. If they don't know, like, and trust you, they aren't going to sole source to you. And fourth, before you pitch a sole source, see how your government customer is doing on their set-aside spending. The government has spending targets for each set-aside, and if your customer is behind on their spending in your set-aside, they might be more open to sole sourcing work to you to push their numbers up. And to figure out whether your customer is on or off target, check out the SBA set-aside scorecard, link in the description below. See right here, HHS is below target on their HUBZone spending. So if you're HUBZone and you're trying to sell to HHS, they might be more open to a sole source. Sole sourcing is awesome, but getting a customer to know, like, and trust you takes time, which you probably don't have. So what can you do? Well, 90% of all new businesses' first contracts are subcontracts, and those can happen fast. I wonder if set-asides help there. Of course they do. Third benefit, set-asides can help you get a subcontract. Sort of. So the government encourages large businesses to subcontract work to small businesses by basically saying, hey large, if you're going to subcontract some of that work, don't just subcontract to other larges, use some smalls also. And quick note, even though there are some similarities, this isn't mentor-protege. We'll talk about mentor-protege soon because it might be the stealth best set-aside benefit. But right now, we're talking about small business subcontracting plans. So here are the federal small business subcontracting plan targets. Pretty significant percentages, right? So a lot of people take a look at these subcontracting targets and assume that these are the percent of the total contract value. So like if a large wins a $100 million contract from HHS, which has a 31% small business subcontracting goal, that prime has to sub out at least 31 million to smalls. That's not what's going on. It's 31% of whatever gets subbed out. This is easiest to explain with an example. So let's see how that large, that $100 million contract can meet their small business subcontracting goals. Well, the easiest way for the large to meet this subcontracting target is to just sub out none of the work. Here's the math. The contract is worth 100 mil. They sub out $0, and 31% of 0 is 0, so they're compliant. Option 2, let's say they subcontract out $10 million of the work, and they sub all 10 mil to other large businesses. Well, on $10 million of subcontracting, they should have subbed 3.1 mil to smalls, but they didn't, so they missed their goal. Shame on them. And options 3, let's say that they sub out 10 mil of the work, 6.9 mil to other large businesses, and 3.1 mil to smalls. So 31% of the subcontracted dollars went to smalls, so they're good. Does that make sense? So that's small business subcontracting plans. A couple of other things to know. First, there are subcontracting targets for women-owned and 8As and everyone else, so it's not just 31% to smalls in general. Second, large businesses don't have to meet these subcontracting goals for every contract as long as they meet these targets across all their contracts. So they could be above goal on some contracts and below goal on others, so long as their average is on target. So bottom line, these subcontracting goals are pretty toothless, and there are lots of small businesses with each set aside out there. So don't expect these subcontracting plan targets to help you get work. Instead, if you want to subcontract to a prime, earn it by helping them win the work in the first place. So here's what I recommend doing. Identify some upcoming contracts that might be a year or two out from release. See who the large businesses are that are interested in that space, which you can find here on the Teaming tab. And I'm showing you how to do this using FedScout because it's free and really easy to use. But you can use SAM and USA Spending, but it's a lot harder. Then, once you find primes who might be interested, look them up on LinkedIn and identify the decision makers. Figure out what you could offer to each of them, or said another way, figure out why they should work with you, and then reach out and start exploring how you can jointly pursue these upcoming opportunities. I know this kind of relationship building is hard and slow, but it is absolutely critical, and there are plenty of tried and true strategies. But if you're feeling down about your chances of having a prime bring you on as a sub, what if I told you that other companies might want to sub to you? The next benefit of having a set aside is that other people might want to sub to you. The idea is like the reverse of our very first benefit about how you should build relationships with other small businesses that have set asides you don't have. Here's a simple example. Let's say you're a new woman-owned small business, and an interesting contract comes out set aside for women-owned small businesses, but it's way too big and complex for you to win it by yourself. Well, large businesses and other small businesses that aren't women-owned small business might want to go after that contract. But to do that, they need a woman-owned small business prime that they can sub to. So if you've been building relationships, one of them might want you to be that prime. So this is great. An established vendor with tons of capabilities and credibility is going to help you win a contract. But remember, everything is a negotiation. And in this scenario, your negotiating position is weak. They've got all the capabilities. And while you've got to set aside, a lot of other companies do too. So that company with all the experience is probably going to pit you and a couple of other small businesses with the woman-owned set-aside against each other to see who will give them the biggest slice of the contract, which kind of sucks for you. But what if there was a way to become a large business's preferred small business partner and avoid all that negotiating? Welcome to Mentor Protégé. So the mechanics of Mentor Protégé are a little fiddly, and if you're new to government contracting, you don't need to understand all the details now. So let's focus on what it is at a high level and why this might be the stealth best set-aside benefit. So I hope you've noticed that a lot of government contracting success comes down to collaboration with other businesses. Well, mentor-protege is like the peak of collaboration. So a mentor-protege relationship is a formal government-recognized relationship between an established government contractor, the mentor, and a less experienced contractor, the protege. And there are a few benefits to the mentor and the protege, but there are two big ones. First, the mentor can provide more support to the protege than they ordinarily could. So they can help with proposals and financing and equity and resources and all kinds of other things that would raise red flags in a non-mentor-protege relationship. Second big benefit, when the mentor subs to the protege, the mentor can get up to 60% of the work. And quick aside, technically the mentor is not subbing to the protege, they're creating a joint venture, but this is an introduction, and for all intents and purposes, the mentor is subbing. So imagine you have the 8 days set aside, and a really great contract comes out, 8 days set aside. But it's too big for you to do by yourself, and there are some really detailed work requirements that you can't meet. So to win, you'd need a really big and experienced partner. But as we've discussed, why would a big experienced partner want to work with you over all the other 8 days out there? Well, if you have a mentor, the answer is easy. They'll always want to work with you. Because if they sub to a non-protege, they're capped at 49% of the work. But if they sub to their protege, they can get an extra 11%. At first this sounds shitty, right? I mean, you're here to make money, so why is giving your large business mentor an extra 11% good? It's because your large business mentor will always want to partner with you. And having a large business standing behind every one of your proposals is going to seriously increase your win rate and the size of the contracts you can pursue and dramatically accelerate your corporate growth. So I don't want to surprise you, but government sales are slow and frustrating, and not just for you. It's frustrating for the government too. And one of the ways that the government can accelerate and simplify the buying process is by using framework agreements, or master services agreements, or IDIQs, or GWACs. There are a lot of different names, but they all kind of work the same. And sales through the agreements, as we saw, is big. Like $100 billion a year to small business big. But if you're not familiar with framework agreements, think about them like airport pre-check. Airports need to make sure that everyone going onto an airplane is safe, so no guns or bombs, right? And airports do this two different ways. The first way is to send everyone through security, have them take all their fluids out of their bags and their electronics, and have them take off their shoes and run them through a scanner. And this works, but it's slow and sucks, which is why the normal security line is always long and slow. The other way airports ensure is through pre-check. So with pre-check, the TSA does a big background investigation once, and if you pass, then every time you fly, you just have to go through a quick scan, which is why pre-check lines tend to be shorter and move faster. So with pre-check, there's an investment, but once you have it, every follow-on trip is faster and easier. And GWACs and IDIQs are basically government sales pre-check. During the GWAC or IDIQ application, the government vets your product and service and your company, and if you pass, you can sell to the government much faster and more easily. And because of the speed and simplicity, the government loves to use them. And there are a bunch of GWACs and IDIQs just for companies with set-asides, and billions flow through them every year to small businesses. Okay, so those are all the benefits that all set-asides have. Now, 3 things specific to particular set-asides. If you have the HUBZone set-aside, on some contracts, you might get a 10% pricing advantage. Not every contract does this, but a lot do, and in simple terms, the pricing benefit works like this. So say you've got the HUBZone set aside and you're bidding against one other company that isn't HUBZone, and the government plans to award the contract to the lowest priced bidder. The other company bids $100,000, you bid $110,000. Now the other company is the lowest bidder, so they should win. But because of your HUBZone pricing preference, the government basically whacks 10% off your bid when they're making their evaluation. So it's as if you bid $99,000, and now you're the low bidder, and you get that $110,000. So I know this seems like a pretty big advantage, but in 2023, the government only did this 281 times. So yeah, seems like this actually isn't happening very much in practice. Next thing, these set-asides last forever. So as long as you're small and you're majority owned by a woman or a disabled vet, or as so long as you meet all the HUBZone location requirements, you can be a HUBZone small business. But 8A only lasts 9 years. And this is a really big deal because, as we've pointed out, to get the most out of your set-aside, you need strong relationships, and those take years to build. So if you're a new business and you apply for an 8A right away, you could easily burn half of your 8A years building those relationships. So I recommend waiting to apply for 8A until you have your foundation set. Third thing, the woman-owned small business set-aside only applies to contracts for certain types of work. I don't know why the government does this, but if you provide any of these products or services, they might not be eligible for a women-owned small business set-aside. The detailed list of work that does and does not qualify is linked in the description below. So if you provide products or services in one of the spaces where women-owned small business can't be used, well, then your women-owned small business set-aside might be a lot less valuable. And that's what set-asides do for you. Now, how to get one. So to get a set-aside, you need two things. First, your company has to be small. And this is actually a pretty confusing analysis, so I'm going to put up a separate video on just size determination, but here's the easy version. If your company made less than 15 mil last year and has less than 100 employees, you're small. If you made more than that, or you have more employees, well, watch my other video. But if you're small, then congrats, that's it. You get the small business set-aside, and you can compete for total small business set-aside contracts. But for the other set-asides, you need to do step 2. So for these set-asides, your company has to be majority owned by one or more people who qualify. For instance, if your company is majority owned by one or more women, you qualify as woman-owned. It could be 1 woman or 10 women, doesn't matter, so long as their total ownership is over 50%. And the same with being owned by service-disabled vets for service-disabled veteran-owned set-aside. And for 8A, you have to be majority owned by people who have had economic hardship, and your total assets and revenue have to be relatively low. And 8A is associated with minority owners because most minorities are assumed to have had economic disadvantage in their lives, so it's relatively easy for them to get this set aside. But if you aren't minority owned, you can still apply for 8A, it's just a little harder. Then we have HUBZone, and this one is different. To qualify, your business's primary location has to be in a HUBZone, and at least 1/3 of your employees have to live in a HUBZone. And if you're interested, there's a link to the HUBZone map in the description, and you can put in your business address and all your employees' addresses to see if you qualify. So assuming you meet those ownership or location requirements, you then apply through the application portal, links in the description. And the SBA handles women-owned small business, 8A and HUBZone, and the VA handles SDVOSB. And the applications are all pretty similar, so there are some things to know. First, the process is slow, so plan on 6 months or more to get approved. Second, they ask for a lot of paperwork and documentation, and you need to give them exactly what they want. If you mess something up and they kick your application back, it's going to add months to your application timeline, so try to get it right the first time. Third, there are plenty of groups you can pay for help, but there are also excellent free services out there, links to those in the description, so be sure to get help. I know that's a lot of information, so let's wrap it up into a work plan so you know what to focus on and when. So right away, I recommend setting up your searches in SAM or FedScout, identifying companies with other set-asides you could partner with, building relationships with those companies, putting in your set-aside applications because it takes a while, so start early, and building a sources sought response that you can use and reuse. Then, once you have your set-aside, put it on your website and any other public documents, like capability statements. Make sure that all your prospective government customers know that you have that set-aside, and then forget about it. Build your business as if it wasn't there, and focus on the fundamentals of creating a product or service that people want, differentiating it, and building relationships with customers and partners. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to make you successful, not your set-aside. Of course, all this set-aside goodness needs relationships to unlock their benefits. So to find out how to identify the people you need to meet at partners and in government and winning strategies to build relationships with them, check out the video on the left. And we're on track to publish 41 videos on how to succeed in the federal market this year, so subscribe to get an alert when new ones come out.